Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our inspiring content. Here is episode 152.
With choice and opportunity in the learning environment, kids tinker on the things that they're interested in tinkering in, and that becomes your strength.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Marlo Payne Thurman. Marlo is a private practice school psychologist and special education consultant with 2 master's degrees in education psychology and school psychology, and a Ph.D. in special education. She owns 2E Consulting Services, directs the US College of Autism Project, and is an adjunct faculty member in the University of Northern Colorado. She believes that a major revolution in education is imperative, and as such, she actively pursues projects that consider neurodiversity in all of its forms towards the creation of autism, play, projects, and problem-based learning models that fully utilize the range of availability of 21st century technologies. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Marlo.
Thank you.
This is going to be such a fun conversation. I was just telling her out of, a year and a half of doing this podcast, I think I've only had one other person come on and actually talk about autism and maybe some of those special neuropsychology things that we have with children. But I want to find out how and why you think that we need a major revolution in education, or why that's imperative, and also your work on autism. But before we get into any of that, please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself.
I started as a school psychologist in 1994, and I've worked in private practice as a private practice school psychologist, and kind of started, my first interest and love was actually autism, and then got hooked up once I came to Colorado with some individuals here that are really well known in the field of gifted education. And so really kind of took a direction that way, and really found myself still seeing kind of the same kids under the term twice exceptional. So gifted kids with learning disabilities, behavior problems, social skills problems in particular. So I kind of started a private practice to really address gifted kids who had other things going on, and they weren't functioning real well in school. They weren't functioning real well socially. Some of them had, behavior problems, those kinds of things. So that was really where I started. And that was, again, in about 1994, 95. And my practice just grew exponentially. So it really told me I'd kind of landed in a niche market. And there weren't a lot of people at that time really specializing in kids who were both gifted and had, these other disabilities going on. In the years that followed, I actually also started a private school. It was called the Verdun School for Exceptional Children, and it was the first twice exceptional school in the United States, according to, some research that was done at that time. So in other words, it was kind of one of those founding 2E programs, or twice exceptional programs. And so we had about 170 kids come through our doors in about a 7 to 10 year time period. All of them identified as being very highly intelligent, but and I do use that word and very loosely, because there was so many different characteristics that came through that. But in those years, I would say that almost always we had about 25 to 30% of our kids were on the autism spectrum somewhere, and obviously some of them very, very high functioning, although we did have a few non-vocal kids. And I want to make that distinction from non-verbal, because some of these kids are very verbal in their mind and they just can't get their mouth to work. So we did have some non-vocal kids. And then from there, it was kind of interesting. I was, busy doing my private practice. We ended up having to close the school. We got it kind of crunched during the hard economic years. And so we ended up having to close the school. I went back to my private practice, and not long after, I was in a really severe car accident, broke my neck in a car wreck.
Wow.
And so spent, the better part of a year in recovery for, neurocognitive stuff and physiological. I had a spinal cord injury. I had to, learn how to swallow and walk and
oh my goodness,
basic functions again. And during that time, I kind of decided I wanted to teach at a university level. So following the accident, I actually started a doctoral program. So my 2 degrees, my 2 master's degrees, which were actually credit-wise the equivalent of a doctoral degree in school psychology and educational psychology, and more specifically, the actual doctoral credits were for a school psychology Ph.D. And that one I ended up with 2 babies and 2 master's degrees instead of the PhD. So I decided I wanted to go back, but rather than take all the same classes I'd taken before, this time I just completed a PhD in special education, where my doctoral thesis was on first-person perceptions on intelligence, cognition, and sensory processing across the autism spectrum. And I worked with a number of adults who, have lived with autism. Some of them were not diagnosed until they were adults. Some of them were diagnosed as children, in kind of recreating perceptions about autism and a lot of discussions about what school should have been and what was good and what wasn't good and kind of the learning style. And I'm in the process, just filed the copyright, in fact, 2 days ago, on publication that is actually a new theory to explain the autism spectrum. So we currently have theories of executive functioning, we have the mind blindness theory, we have the hypersystemizing theories of Baron Cohen. We have, so in other words, we have these different cognitive behavioral theories that have come out through the years to try and explain the core features of autism spectrum disorder. And I will be actually proposing a new theory that I think is more comprehensive and complete in understanding the autism spectrum. And I'll be presenting that for the first time at the United States Autism World Conference on the 14th of August, and I will be the opening keynote at the World Conference.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, and we were talking before we started recording that autism diagnoses for autism has increased. And tell us a little bit more about that and what you're finding and how you feel like, were we just disdiagnosing? What's your theory behind why there's an increase?
Well, I do think, and by the way, this is what you'll hear in my new book. This is what you'll hear in my session. So this is definitely the world according to Marlo. So I need to preface it with that. But again, based on this research and based on kind of my life's work in working with kind of this higher functioning autism spectrum, I personally believe that autism is a neurodiverse learning style. In other words, we've always had individuals with a kind of a quirky learning style. They're real bright. They're socially kind of odd. They're, we called them eccentric. We called them sensitive. They were the professors and you go back in history and clear back into the late 1700s, we hear these stories of the math calculator that comes up in these little newspapers. And you hear the stories of these people who publish all this research in their lifetime, but were just odd ducks. In other words, I think that there's several components. I do think that there is a genetic learning style. And I'll talk about that if you like.
Oh, yeah.
But I also think, and by the way, the research is really pretty clear to say that autism is caused, it is a combination of genetics and environmental load, toxic environmental loading. So in other words, the belief in the top researchers, and I'm talking, Martha Herbert and Valerie Hu, and some of these researchers that are at these high research universities in autism, they're all saying two things: that there is a genetic line and that there is some loading. In other words, that these kids are sensitive, they're more prone to have allergies, they're more prone to have digestive issues, they're more prone to have, stomach problems, they're more prone to have skin problems. So in other words, for some reason and again, this is the world according to Marlo, I believe that this epigenetic learning style, this neurodiverse learning style, actually is more sensitive to environmental load. So in other words, these are the kids who, when you line them up for vaccinations, even though we know the vaccinations in and of themselves don't have a direct link to causing autism, these are the kids who are sensitive, so they're the ones who have the autism characteristics or the disabled part or the damaged part of the autism spectrum. Certainly, we are doing a better job of identifying. We have a clearer picture of what autism really is. So, when you think autism really has only been in the literature since 1942 and 1943 with Kanner and Asperger, we really have not even had it on our radar, but I think it's always been there. So again, to summarize that, I think there's an epigenetic loading that comes through the genome, and then I think there's also an environmental overlay that is loading. So in other words, it's toxicities, and your exposure to multiple toxins makes you more, in other words, it contributes to more damage in your learning style of autism.
Okay, so there is some credibility to people that say that their immunizations may cause it, correct?
Well, you can't say there's a causal factor, but there's a correlational component.
Okay.
In other words, there are kids that we know were normal until they went and got vaccinated, but you can't see that the autism, the research doesn't show that the autism caused. By the way, that's not 100% true. If you look at
that the immunization caused it, but it just brought it out. Is that
that's a very political hot topic, to be honest.
Yeah, it is.
About that, or kind of explore that a little bit from both sides. The National Vaccine Council does a nice job of talking about the cases that were supported, and by the way, it was through a national vaccine court, that there were a few cases that were proven to be caused by the vaccines. But we can't say that, first of all, you can't say autism was caused completely by vaccines, because there's a lot of kids who have autism who didn't have that particular, course of vaccines, or didn't have the vaccine. When we changed the vaccine schedules and we changed the vaccine elements and components and ingredients, it didn't change the autism rates.
Yeah.
So that wasn't the only environmental loading. But we do know that places where there's poor air quality, that we have a higher, it seems like autism is more prevalent in those areas. So in other words, there's still a lot unknown about the what, but the researchers, and again, this is not my expertise, I'm quoting others who are very knowledgeable about that, we have two components. It is genetics plus, and that plus appears to be multitude of environmental loading and toxicities that can happen in the environment.
Wow. Well, and what are some challenges that you've seen along the way with, trying to get that, or trying to understand that better, and maybe what have you learned from it? I mean, what are some ways that parents can help with that environmental component?
Well, I think we all have to start thinking about sustainability of our planet, to be really honest. I mean, we need to be thinking about our food sources, and I hate to go off on the deep end and be, gluten-free, casein-free, wheat-free, dairy-free, egg-free. You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't want to, that's not my specialty or expertise. But I do think for many of these kids, one of the things that we know, all of our, well, I wouldn't say all, but a high percentage, certainly in the 90 percentile of our kids on the spectrum, they have digestive issues. They have gut function issues. And so we have to start questioning what that is and how we can help them with that, because we know when we help with that, that doesn't cure everything. In fact, it doesn't, make the autism go away, but we do know they feel a lot better. They're a lot healthier, then they have some energy left over to do other things. And I think that's the main point, is understanding that it's an energy game. And if you've got to spend all your energy just digesting your food, then you don't have much left over for learning.
Yeah. I have heard like sugar corn syrup type stuff too is also something that you have to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that's definitely one challenge.
I would say I'm not, I have a little bit of that training, but I'm not the nutritionist. There's definitely people that are experts in that. What I think I bring to the table that is unique is an understanding of kind of the cognitive style of autism, and then really how that cognitive style, and by the way, not just kids with autism, but lots of kids, the cognitive style that they bring to the table does not fit our current definition of what school is.
Yeah. Well, and let's kind of talk about that. That's definitely a challenge too with education. In your bio, we talked about how, you want to see a major revolution in education. That's imperative. What are your visions of what the education looks like going forward?
Well, I think it's really tricky. We're in a realm of education right now that is very factory model driven. So in other words, how we have defined education as this kind of systematic application of information to a child through a sitting and listening kind of process has been kind of the definition of education for a couple hundred years now, 150 for sure. And what we are figuring out, especially under like No Child Left Behind, when we got really systematic at doing that, when we got really good at measuring that, when we got really good at putting standards around what it is that kids are learning and how do we prove that they learned it, what I think we're finding is that, they learned it, but that didn't make them any more prepared to be an adult than the kids 200 years before them, or even the kids, of the 60s and 70s who had no standards in education. So I do think that there's, I have a couple heroes, and I go back to, even Dewey, who really said learning is doing. And I really believe that we're in an era where learning by doing has got to take place in a different way. In other words, when we talk about doing now, we talk about, we'll take a break from the desk work and from our regular school, and we'll go do some little 15-minute, kind of take a break project. And I really think, we need to be really revamping all of our educational system towards teaching today's kids, not only based on their learning style. We know a whole lot more about learning than we did, in 150 years ago.
Yeah.
But yet how we teach is still pretty much the same. And the idea that children from the age now of 3 or 4 years old, all the way up until, they're 18 years old, are going to sit still in a desk or a chair for 6-8 hours a day is sort of ridiculous when we consider that alongside of kind of the history of humans. In other words, when in any other period of history have children learned outside of their families, outside of their parents' kind of watchful eyes, and sitting and listening to somebody talk to them all day long? And we are certainly seeing some things in our visual media, some educational technologies that are starting to take shape, but we have some problems there too. In other words, the educational technologies that we're creating are basically just the same, only to replace the teacher.
Yeah.
So it's video of a teacher talking, the teacher talking, and you might get to watch a few, there might be a few still images, or if you're really lucky, you might have a little video clip to watch, but it's not the same as authentic, hands-on, project-based learning. And I think that's what I really think needs to happen. So when I say authentic, I mean that kids are actually solving problems that are real. They're not imagined. They're not created for the classroom. They're not kind of this childhood is this blessed place where children aren't part of the adult life. It's that children have the ability to contribute and sometimes outthink adults in their ability to solve authentic problems. So that's the first thing I think needs to happen, is we need to reimagine what the world's problems are. And by the way, that's what education should be, is teaching children how to grow up and contribute to solving the world's problems.
Wow, I just got a real flutter in my heart. I mean, you're definitely a lady after my own heart. I really believe that we have separated children away from real life, and then when we push them out into it, they just flounder. What we've been giving them for 18 years hasn't been, realistic to what goes on in the rest of the world. Well, and I kind of want to talk about testing and autism and exceptional learning anyway, because we try to go more standardized with the testing, but yet we see this increase of kids that have autism and all these special learning things. And then we think that they're unintelligent or whatever because they can't circle in squares on pieces of paper.
And the more standardized and narrow our definition of education has become, the broader the group of children who don't fit.
Yeah.
The larger and broader And so what's happened, I think, and by the way, it probably does contribute to our rise in autism, because we probably had a lot of quirky little odd duck kids running around in the 40s and 50s in our school systems. But because there were so many modalities for doing school, and there were so many different types of teachers, and there were so many definitions, broad definitions of learning, that those kids kind of found a place. And by the way, many of the individuals I talked to in my study were in their, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what they all told me is they would have not survived in today's schools. And so, in fact, some of them have their own children, and they're saying, school has changed a lot, and it's become a lot more narrow in its definition. It's become a lot more, and by the way, I'm all about measuring progress. I'm all about having some standards and having some accountability. But I think what's happened is we put standards, we put accountability, and when we think about, what we're going to teach, there's no standards around what the creation of the curriculum was. We just kind of accepted that what we have been teaching is what we will continue to teach. And I think that's the place that standards-based education is failing today's kids, because what we're teaching them in the classroom may or may not be relevant to their adult lives at all. And I think it's still the application of information. So in other words, we're still teaching the same as if information was this valuable commodity that we rode in on the back of a horse.
Yeah.
So teaching kids how to manage information, it's not like we have a shortage of it. Kids don't need to remember that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. I mean, that's a Google search. It takes faster than it does take the memory power to actually memorize those facts. So that's where I'm saying it's almost like, it's not that I think standards should go away. It's not the how we assess education that needs to change. It's the what we're teaching. And that's where you get to, it's not about modifying what we're doing. It's about revolutionizing what we're doing. It's changing completely the what we teach to prepare children to be valuable contributors to today's world.
Yeah. We've improved in the fact that we've been able to identify, autism, stuff like that, but we're almost more hostile. We want to integrate it into the school system, but yet, a lot of teachers are not set up to handle, maybe a large classroom where you've got all these different, really highly intelligent, kind of off the spectrum type autism type kids.
Those kids can be low functioning too. It's unfair to talk about autism without talking about those kids who are completely non-vocal, those kids who really can't perform tasks of self-care, those kids who really sit and stim all day. Those are part of the spectrum as well. But we unfortunately assume that means there's no intelligence there.
Yeah.
As opposed to that, we haven't figured out how to tap or capture that intelligence in some kind of a meaningful way. So I think one of the core elements when you talk about revolutionizing education, you have to get away from developmental normal. In other words, to say that every child born on planet Earth should go through and be compared to every other child for normal versus abnormal. So it's that whole developmental paradigm that's part of the problem. And by the way, we've lived on this planet a lot of years before the behavioral psychologists came along. And we, I believe, as a species of humans on this planet, could recognize that there were very broad differences in the human condition. And by the way, very different levels of functioning. And so we've defined that, success academically, vocationally, and even professionally is to be able to go through school and get these grades, and then be able to go to a good college, and then be able to get your college degree, and then be able to join the workplace and make money. And for certainly a number of kids, and probably even the majority of kids, those standardized tests that we use do a pretty good job of predicting how well the kid is going to perform in our existing school system, and therefore what is their likelihood of getting a good job because of a good education. I think that's what our tests do now. But for the kids who fall outside of the norm on those tests, and that can be the gifted kids, the twice exceptional kids, or the disabled kids, we don't have any sense of what that really looks like, except, oops, that's bad.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong. I think that we should be looking at kids very differently and saying, okay, so they didn't perform on our standard IQ test, they don't perform on our standardized academic achievement test, and instead of assuming that means they're not smart or capable, I think that's where the ball should really just begin to roll around, okay, well, what is it that they can do? What is it that they can contribute? What are their interests? What are their passions? And by the way, we all learn better when we're learning on our interests and our passion. And school for the masses hasn't had the energy or time to even ask that question.
Yeah.
Well,
and the testing is a kind of end-all, be-all, right? I mean, what you're saying, what testing should be is like, okay, well, they're not performing in this, so, what can they do? I mean, you're wanting to expand upon the testing, not just use it as like, this child doesn't fit in this system.
Well, and it's to expand on the testing. It's to actually create new, and by the way, one of the things I'm proposing in this new theory is that we actually throw out IQ testing for kids on the spectrum. Because they have, I believe, and this is where it gets into, some of the things I'll be presenting in this book and at this conference, is that there is a learning style there that is very strong. They have some really phenomenal aptitudes, particularly in our kind of high-tech science, technology, engineering, math world that aren't adequately measured at all on our IQ tests, and we miss them because we don't have instruments to see them as strengths. So we only see the deficits, and then we use those deficits to really limit opportunity for these kids, when really these are kids who probably shouldn't even take IQ tests, to be really honest, because the scores don't give us any information that really helps us figure out how to educate them. I believe that in autism in particular, and by the way, I am also really well-versed in dyslexia too, but I believe that there are different neurocognitive learning styles that are not at all aligned with our current definition of testing or our current definition of school. Yeah. And so these are the individuals who are falling out of the system, which, by the way, historically, going back, individuals with dyslexia, you look at individuals with autism, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, they were geniuses.
Yeah, like Thomas Edison.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, yeah. Before we go on, let's listen to this message. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, theluminousmind.net, get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. The Luminous Mind with Marlo Payne Thurman, helping to consult twice exceptional students. Well, let's talk about some of your consulting then, of what how you direct parents and educators to help some of these special, high functioning or what do you call them?
Right, but asynchronous or neurocognitively diverse is probably the best, to kind of pin it down. They're neurocognitively different-minded or neurocognitively diverse kids.
Yeah, so how do you help families like this and then educate them?
I mean, that sounds like I just contradicted myself. I am a school psychologist. And by the way, that's why I have such strong opinions about testing, because I've tested 4,000 or 5,000 kids over the years. But the assessments, a lot of it, in other words, some of the tools are there if we don't average and generalize and compare. If we use the tools to tell us there's a very nice strength here, this is a real challenge here, here's what we can do here. So the things that I do assessments for the very, comprehensive assessment of all the strengths and weaknesses of a kid, not for the purpose of diagnosing them, but for the purpose of identifying their learning style and all their individual and intricate kind of strengths and weaknesses and how those are going to play out in a classroom, or if they should even be in the classroom. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing I do is take, assessment data, observation data, and generally relationship time with kids. So, I've worked with literally thousands of kids at this point. I can spend a few minutes with a kid and really kind of pick up on some stuff. So sensory things, auditory processing, visual things, kids who aren't healthy, and you can tell they have allergies because they have big black circles around their eyes. I mean, there's just a lot of little things that you can pick up on. So figuring out what those things are and helping these kids play what I call the energy game. So in other words, you're bleeding out here on listening in a noisy classroom because you have a central auditory processing disorder. So what happens if we put you in a classroom that's quiet or give you an FM system so that you're not listening to all this background noise all the time? Now you're not wasting energy there. You're not wasting energy digesting your food. You're not wasting energy, holding a pencil because your hands won't manipulate a pencil. So it's figuring out where the energy is going, figuring out how we can divert some of that energy towards strengths, interests, and passions. And by the way, I mean this 100%, every single successful adult that I've met that has autism, that has dyslexia, that had severe learning disabilities as a kid, they didn't grow up to do the thing they couldn't do. They grew up to do the thing that they found a passion that gave them the energy to overcome their disabilities so they could do that thing they love.
And maybe that's the difference between these kids and maybe a kid that's right on track that maybe we would classify as normal. I'm doing that with air quotes, but maybe those kids that are normal with the air quotes can just do jobs that they don't really enjoy doing. And these kids are meant to, let's talk about some of those successes that you were kind of talking about of, how do we find that from these kids, what they can do? And we've all heard the 60-minute story of, the kid that the school thought was retarded or whatever and wasn't helping him, and the mom pulls him out and does, certain things, and now he's at 16, he's a math professor or something like that. Tell us some of those success stories and maybe how parents can find that help and figure out those things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I do have to correct you, we are actually definitely don't use the term retarded anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is intellectual disability on that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, within that, I think, first of all, let me talk about autism specifically, because I do think that in autism, the answer for kids with autism is different for other groups. So in autism specifically, I think we have to understand that these kids have a very narrow but completely detailed memory system. So in other words, the way they process memories is with absolute 100% detail for all of the sensory experience tied to the memory. However, because that's so much information, the band of memory is narrow. In other words, the amount that they remember, they don't generalize memories. It's a very specific, detailed memory. It tends to be. The other thing is that the focus and attention, interest, is tied to that memory system. So in other words, in autism, we start out with a sensory superhighway. So you and I have, a couple lanes of sensory information coming at us all the time. These kids have 10, 12, 16, 20 lanes, and they're all going full speed. And so the first thing is really addressing the sensory overload pieces. It's not a sensory integration disorder. It's actually more sensory processing and less filtering of the sensory environment, which then contributes to very specific and detailed memories that are complete. These guys remember, these are people who remember a song that they heard when they were 7 and can literally play that song with enough detail that they can hear a horn, a blow of a horn in that musical instrument that they didn't hear the last time they played that song in their head.
Wow.
In other words, it's a complete detail. So we've got the sensory system, we've got the memory system, we've got focus and interest. In other words, it's nearly impossible to have focus and interest on something that you don't have a very specific band of information for. So that's where we get that really rigid interest. In other words, they can only remember what they're interested in, and they can only focus on what they're interested in because that's where the memory base is. And then from there, that really kind of evolves into a really different cognitive experience interacting with the world. And finally, then, of course, then the social stuff is affected because these individuals have a very different social growing up than other kids.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of talked about, I was reiterating the story of Jacob Barnett, where the mom, when she pulled him out and they focused on the things that he could do, you know, It did pull him back into her world. You know, he became very nonverbal, but as she integrated into his world, he came back and, you know, and started having more social interaction with her. So I'm understanding, I guess what you're saying basically is that because he had memories with her working with, you know, in the areas that he was strong in, it also created a better social interaction between the two of them.
But it also expanded the things that he could learn, because in other words, she was building on his existing, you know, memory system, or his existing focus, interest, passion system. In other words, there's very narrow bands of memory and very narrow bands of focus, both. And so to kind of put that together, then you have to join the child in that interest, in that focus, in those things that they have stored in their memory, and then you can expand those out. But to just apply a bunch of unrelated, unsystematic facts. And by the way, when you say, what is school? It is the application of unrelated and non-systematic information.
Yeah. Let's kind of talk about that, of what that might look like for each child and how to harness that kind of quickly, I guess.
I think it definitely has to start with interests. I think that's the first thing you have to do is, what does this kid love to do and why? And then kind of build on that and, you know, help that child expand that interest into some kind of a tangible, usable, practical, real-world skill.
Well, and kind of what I was thinking when you were talking about that too is that this goes way beyond just taking your child, dropping him off at the school, and then letting a teacher, because there's just not that. This sounds very one-on-one, I guess, is what I'm trying to, you know, it's very personalized. I mean, what does the busy parent do that maybe doesn't have time to sit down and, you know, work on that one interest? You know, what are some ways that we can, I guess, personalize the learning?
As parents, the best thing we can do is forward, you know, tinker spaces, forward, you know, maker space, forward authentic project-based learning in our schools. Because what happens is, you're right, to actually do the educational system we have now with a kid who is that neurodiverse would require a highly skilled teacher working with that child one-on-one all day long. But guess what? That need falls away when you put that child in an authentic project-based, you know, hands-on learning world, because once you put them, their strengths come out. They start doing the things that they're interested in. With choice and opportunity in the learning environment, kids tinker on the things that they're interested in tinkering in, and that becomes your strength. So in other words, that's the revolution, is to take away this whole idea that children learn by sitting and listening and talking to an adult.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So throw that out completely. You're right. To drop a kid off at school and expect that this is going to happen, what I'm talking about, it won't, because there's not the highly skilled one-on-one support to really be able to adapt everything that a kid needs to learn, but teach it to them through talking.
Oh, yeah. Guess what I'm picturing in my mind as you're talking about tinkering. I mean, we grew up in a time where as children, we were left alone a lot to, you know, to really examine and explore the world with our hands and with our feet. And I mean, we were out doing things and just letting us, giving us that time to just grow. Maybe one of the problems with our education system too is too much supervision. Do you think that that's...
Well, it's not even too much supervision. It's too much direct oral instruction.
Yeah, expecting.
When you think about it, it's not only just the time you spend in school. Our kids now can't even have part-time jobs, because if they're keeping up on their homework, there's no time for them to have a part-time job. So, you know, let's think about one thing. Let's get rid of homework and let our kids work in the community. Let them volunteer at the food bank. Let them be involved in their church or their civic duties. I mean, kids learn by doing things.
Yeah.
They don't learn everything they need to learn about being adult by reading it out of a book or having somebody tell them. And that's where I'm saying that, you get authentic, hands-on, real project-based learning. And by the way, the trick has been, because we had project-based learning some in the 60s and 70s, but we didn't have the accountability piece. We didn't have standards-based assessments around it. We could do that. We could actually build project-based learning that was authentic, that had standards and accountability on it. That's the revolution. And when you do that, that opens the arena for kids with multiple learning disabilities or neurodiverse cognitive differences to be able to come into that learning world and do the thing they do well.
Yeah, I'm just getting excited thinking about what you're saying there, that I can see how we have gone wrong in that discovery and that authentic play. So that's great. So as a parent, I mean, that is easier to do, necessarily giving your children somewhat of the freedom to be able to kind of explore and letting them have that time. So that
Right.
does sound easier.
Yeah. Let me add one more piece to the equation,
Okay.
which is the really exciting piece. At my school, we did the entire school was, at the time, it was basically called live action role play. So in other words, the entire curriculum sequence, reading, writing, math, science, social studies, humanities, we turned all of those into academic standards. We embedded them into LARPs, live action role play sequences, and the kids reenacted historical themes that required them to, learn reading, learn how to read about things, learn how to write, learn how to do math. They had to build projects, they had to do oral presentations, but they were all actually related to the curriculum. So there's nothing that they were doing just because they had to. They learned and did these things because it was required for them to rescue the princess from the castle.
Oh, wow.
That's
Yeah.
hard. And I'll tell you why it was hard, because we were in a time, and that would have been, 10 years ago, where computer laptops were $1,500. So, in other words, for a kid to be mobile with a device that they can hold in their hand and research. I mean, if we could do Pokemon Go and put, Pokemon out in nature, why can't we put academic content standards out in nature?
That is a wonderful idea. I see how that would really spark the child's interest instead of just telling them, you give them a challenge and then that creates the interest.
But by the way, now carry that one step further, and I have to kind of walk people forward in incremental steps, because the idea is so big that most people, it's like, oh, wow, that's like just blew my mind kind of big. But what if our educational revolution of the future put children into some kind of a virtual world where they were literally going through time and exploring, the Roman people and time period and Colosseum and all of that through virtual problem solving, and then came out of the virtual world to work in a brick and mortar classroom with a teacher who is more of a guide than an instructor.
Yeah. Well, and the teaching is going to have to change, correct? I mean, just the frontal. Yeah.
I think our teachers have to be information support technologists.
Yeah. No, that does.
Information of everything a child needs to learn is out there. It's not that the teacher has to deliver it anymore. The teachers have to help with access. The teachers have to help in direction. And by the way, you really could create an educational world where these things are embedded within this virtual world. So the kids aren't, out looking at porn or accessing things that are not safe for them, because you can't just turn the child loose on the world either. There's some things there, but that way all the standards and all the content could be actually measured too. In other words, you could keep track of where a kid goes in a virtual world and what he learns, and measure his standards and assess his progress and print out a report to the teacher.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, all the information is there, and really the teacher needs to be there to help them in places that they're just struggling, that they want to get through, that maybe they can't break down that barrier of knowledge.
And by the way, there will always be kids that require direct instruction from, highly trained special education teachers. there is definitely a skill set that special educators have that doesn't exist anywhere else. But the problem we have, especially under No Child Left Behind, is that all these kids are in the same classroom in an oral lecture format, and the teacher has a really hard time delivering that one-on-one. Kids need some one-on-one time with grown-ups. They can't grow up without adults helping them.
That is wonderful. Yeah. And so as parents, I guess what I'm getting from what you're saying too is that if you have children, you need to be conscious of the idea that you need to be there for those kids, that dropping them off isn't
not doing that. And this school is not doing it. And it's not because, and by the way, I'm not faulting the schools. I've been an educator my whole life. The schools are doing the best they can with the demand they have and the resources they have. This is the model of education that we have. So that's where I'm saying, it's not about reforming it. It's not about throwing more money at it. It's not about training the teachers better. It's about actually rethinking the whole thing, throw out the baby and the bathwater, and really start over with an entirely new definition of what we want our kids to know how to do by the time they're 21 years old.
That is wonderful. Well, before we say goodbye, I really want to know you've talked about going to this conference and writing your book that you have, but what does the future look like for you? What are some ways that you're trying to expand yourself?
Well, I think you probably already guessed. My minor, I have a Ph.D. in special education with double minors, one in statistics, because I do believe in assessment. I don't believe in just free for all. On the second part of it, I have another minor in educational technology, and I think it's time that we put educators in the role of developing educational technology, because right now we have kind of computer guys developing educational technology, and it's not that there's anything wrong with them in particular, but they don't have 10 years of schooling on what education should be changing into.
Also, some coding skills might be really useful for teachers to do, right?
That, or even if the educational technology companies that are there were hiring consultants. So that's what I'd like to do. I would like to consult on a huge school revolution movement that is highly aligned with, really cutting edge educational technologies. That's a goal I have for myself. I definitely will always continue my private practice because I like working one-on-one with kids and, really figuring them out and figuring out how to articulate that and how to advocate for them under whatever version of special ed law we're working with. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is I'd really like to see a lot of change around the concept of neurodiversity for individuals with autism, individuals with dyslexia. In other words, dyslexia is not a disability. Autism might not, especially in the highest functioning versions, the kids who aren't damaged by, environment or whatever. Those kids, that may not be a disability. It might just be a different style, and we have to get much better at working with and identifying those needs so that we can know what works for neurodiverse kids.
Yeah, talk about an environmental deficiency of how we're just treating them, correct?
Oh, correct. So it's research teaching. I'm going to be teaching at the university, probably only 1 or 2 classes a semester, so I have time to do the rest. But those are kind of my big visions. And to be honest, I'm almost 50. I'm getting tired.
Eventually, you like to slow down.
Well, maybe my words just inspire somebody in the next generation to come along and rethink these things. But I think that if I can do one thing, it's really to help people think about education and really ask why. Why are we doing what we're doing? Is it relevant that we keep doing it this way, or does it make sense to change the way we're doing it? And we have to get back to this core thing that education was always supposed to raise children to be happy, healthy, functioning adults. It no longer appears to be doing that.
Yeah. Oh, well, I love it. All right. Well, before we say goodbye, just give us the final parting word and then also your contact information, how we can get in touch with you and find out more about your book and then also some of your services that you have.
Yeah, I think my final parting word is children learn by doing and by playing. And we have got to bring play and activity back into childhood. In terms of my contact, I can be reached. Actually, I'm rebuilding a website right now, so for lots of reasons. But so really my best contact is my email at 2E, number 2, letter E, which stands for twice exceptional. That's the acronym for twice exceptional. So 2E consulting services at gmail.com. I will be presenting at the US Autism World Conference, which is coming up, and you can go to that organization at usautism.org. And even if you don't come to the conference, this is one of the few conferences that does live video streaming of the entire conference worldwide. So you can actually log in and watch certain sessions of that conference. And that might be a way you can hear about the autism study. And I'm probably a year out on the publication on the book. The title of the dissertation is First Person Perceptions in Autism, or in Cognition, Sensory Process. No, hang on. In Intelligence, Cognition, and Sensory Processing in Autism. And I have actually got that, even though I bought that under copyright, it's under an embargo right now until I can get the book wrapped up.
Well, great. Well, when you finish your book, I'd definitely love to have you back on to just talk about that. That would be great. Oh, again, her contact information is 2, the number 2, econsultingservices@gmail.com. However, we're going to be sure to link all that information that we've discussed today on our website as well. So thank you so much, Marlo, for coming and joining us and helping to light our minds on fire.
Thank you. I appreciate what you are doing because I think it's very, very needed.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Marlo Payne Thurman, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and get our new monthly newsletter. Then check out our services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of inspiring content, go to the sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.